Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to be giving a talk called Drugs, Pleasure and Sexual Experiences, Cross-Sectional Internet Survey from the Global Drug Survey. So the reason I do pleasure is because although Adam Winstock, who founded the Global Drug Survey, kind of calls this aspect of his Global Drug Survey pleasure, it's more kind of pleasurable benefits versus harms of the drugs. So more kind of benefits versus harms, but it does include some pleasurable aspects. And also, it's not solely about psychedelic drugs, it's about a whole range of commonly used recreational drugs. And apparently the PowerPoint isn't working properly, so I have to do it like this. So yeah, my name's Will Lorne. I'm a PhD student at UCL at the Clinical Psychopharmacology Unit, supervised by Val Curran and Celia Morgan. You might recognise Val from the Drugs Live programme, which she did with David Nutt and some other people. And Celia Morgan's done most of her career on ketamine. And then Adam Winstock on the right, he's the one that founded the Global Drug Survey. And so I do kind of boring number crunching and data analysis for him, and then get to do fun talks and hopefully write papers in return. And my PhD is looking at reward processing in addiction, but this is all about the acute effects of different recreational drugs. So before I start, I promised Adam that I'd advertise two other things that he's involved with, called the Drugs Meter and the Drinks Meter. So they're completely anonymous websites where you just put in the drugs that you use, how frequently you use them, and it gives you feedback on your drink and drug usage compared to other people, your age, your gender, where you're from. So it's supposed to be able to kind of tell you if you're taking way too many drugs, or maybe you're not taking enough drugs, I don't know. But so it can kind of give you an idea of where you are in relation to other people, so you're kind of okay. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk, I'm going to give a brief description of the Global Drug Survey and how it works, so that you have context about where the data's where the data's coming from. And then I'm going to present and discuss our findings concerning self-reported effects of 10 recreational drugs on pleasure outcomes, or more broadly, benefits and harms. And then I'm going to present and discuss our findings concerning self-reported effects of 10 commonly used drugs on sexual pleasure, desire, and performance. So you might go away knowing which drug to use when you're next having sex, although I definitely don't recommend with the results that we have. So the Global Drug Survey, it's a big online survey asking you about the drugs that you take, how often you take them, how they affect you, all that kind of thing. So here's an example of the kind of thing that comes up in Mixmag. So it was started between Adam Winstock and Mixmag, a dance music magazine, and they bring out things like this, so showing the proportion of people who have used these different drugs. So most people have used alcohol who are taking the survey, and interesting comparison between amount of people using LSD from the UK in comparison to the US. Although it's a completely self-nominating sample, so it's not a true representation of either country, so you can't generalize to the whole population. But those kind of things are the kind of interesting results that you can get from such a big survey. So it's expanded recently across the globe, and now we have many more media partners like The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, Gay Times, NBC, Fairfax Media. And in 2013, over 22,000 people took the survey. So make sure that you do this year. It will come out in November time. And it's also good for bringing out kind of high-impact journal articles, so it can get up-to-date information on new drugs coming up. So this came out in 2010 when methadone began to grow in popularity. And that's one of the reasons why I'm involved, because I want to kind of write these academic papers to help my career. So what's pleasure and why is it here? Well, we need to direct our behavior to things that help us survive. So we have sex to help our genes continue, and we eat food so that we survive, and the reward system has evolved so that we are driven to things that make our genes continue. So I've just got a picture here, the top brain picture, an accurate diagram, the one below not so accurate, but so you can see that there's a pathway called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway that goes from the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, to the nucleus accumbens, and that's key in telling us when we should be motivated to go for something that's going to kind of help us survive. So if you see some food or something in a rat, then that dopamine transmission will underlie the motivation to go and get that food. And so pleasure's probably evolved because of that, although not due to that pathway. That's a kind of common misconception, but the pleasure is here to make us feel good when we do things that help our genes survive. So when we have sex, when we eat food, and that's an evolutionary consequence of it helping us survive. However, humans take pleasure from many more things, as this kind of very inaccurate diagram shows, but that, you know, it's not just food and sex. We take pleasure from Liam Neeson and the failures of others, a favourite of mine. But generally, a good definition: a state or feeling of happiness or satisfaction resulting from an experience that one enjoys, or kind of a general sense of niceness might be pleasure in terms of our human subjective experience. And so, as I said before, one of the main things to look at was which drugs provide the most benefits and the least harm, and that might give you the most pleasure. So there's been various work looking at how drugs lead to harmful benefits. Harmful consequences. So David Nutt, of course, David Nutt and colleagues did those famous papers in 2007 and 2010 with experts rating the harmful consequences of taking different drugs. So alcohol, this was in his 2010 paper, alcohol at the top there, and ecstasy, LSD, and magic mushrooms way down the bottom. And that importantly took into account different weightings of the different aspects of harm. So he had things like harm to the individual through dependence and harm to society, and then the experts, whoever they were, I don't remember, kind of said which aspects of those are the most important, and that was involved in the ratings of harm, and alcohol came up top there. But going on to benefits, Carhart, Harris and Nutt also did a questionnaire with users rather than experts, showing that LSD and psilocybin leads to the greatest proportion of people saying that they've had very positive or positive effects on their mental health and on their general well-being, and also the least negative effects on those things, on mental health. And Celia Morgan, one of my supervisors, looked at chronic and acute benefits of different drugs. So that's the graph down here. And so the chronic benefits, you know, the positives of taking drugs after the acute effects have finished. LSD, the third one along there, has the highest chronic benefits. Ecstasy and cannabis, the top two acute benefits. So that's rated by users, not experts, whoever the experts are. And, but then Celia did it again in an international survey and actually found that hallucinogens were rated low benefit and low harm. So that's quite surprising. And of course, Roland Griffiths has done those studies showing that psilocybin can improve well-being years after being given psilocybin. So there's various stuff looking at benefits and harms. But we wanted to kind of have a more rigorous 10 positive aspects, 10 negative aspects that each drug was rated on by users who have used those drugs, so that we could kind of determine in order of a composite pleasure versus harmful consequences scale. And so a hypothesis was that hallucinogens will score highly on benefits, low on harms, and generally be rated positively by users. And we also looked at whether there would be an optimal frequency of drug taking. So we had data on how frequently people were using each drug, and then you might say, okay, well, perhaps people are going to be taking the most pleasure from using it X amounts of time in a year, and reducing your harm that way. So maybe taking LSD once a month gives you more pleasure than once a year, but also more pleasure than once a day or something like that. So we wanted to look at those relationships. So the net pleasure index, as Adam Winstock called it, included these aspects, but as I said before, it's not really just pleasure. So if you used a drug in the last year, you were asked to rate the effect of that drug on these outcomes between 0 and 10. So 10 is maximum positive effect and also maximum negative effect on these outcomes. So I won't bore you by reading them all out, but it included things like increases in mood, increases in pleasure from social interactions, increases in self-awareness and understanding, and some negatives unpleasant physical effects when intoxicated, unpleasant psychological effects when intoxicated, feeling lousy afterwards. So some of those are kind of more directly related to pleasure, like increase in mood or increase in pleasure from social interactions, and others like legal and criminal justice consequences, like that's not really particularly related to pleasure per se, but still interesting for the benefits versus harms of these drugs. So these are the results for the positive items in terms of their rankings. So I've put in bold MDMA and the hallucinogens, given that they crop up much more frequently than the others. So MDMA scoring very highly on increases in mood, increases in pleasure from social interactions, increased enjoyment and capacity for sex and physical activity. We'll come on to that later a bit more. And relief from pain and worries. And then LSD and magic mushrooms also cropping up a lot there in different aspects. So it seems like MDMA and hallucinogens, and also cannabis coming up as well quite a lot, seem to be rated very positively by users for these positive pleasurable outcomes. And for the negative outcomes, our favourite legal drug, alcohol, doing very badly. So unpleasant physical effects when intoxicated, alcohol, doing risky things, alcohol, negative effects on your ability to work, study and progress, alcohol, unwanted effects on physical health, alcohol, negative effects on intimate and close personal relationships, alcohol. So the users who are rating this, who actually, alcohol was the drug used most by the people doing this survey, and although it's a biased survey because people who like drugs are more likely to take this survey, they're still using alcohol a lot and they're still rating it extremely negatively. So this is a graph showing both the positive, negative and composite ratings, so that's when you add the positive and negative ones together. And just firstly note the huge variation in the number of people rating each drug, obviously because some drugs are more popular than others, and that has problematic consequences on the interpretation of what it might mean. But so for example, alcohol, 20,000 people rated it, whereas methadone, only 800. But I'll talk about that problem later. But as you can see, MDMA rated as having the greatest benefits relative to harms with 39, that's the composite rating, and then followed by LSD and magic mushrooms. And note the ratings of harm there are very low for magic mushrooms and LSD. But interestingly, MDMA negative aspects, the kind of the harmful ones, is fairly high in comparison to the others. Alcohol and methadone, both as bad as each other, apparently, rated by users, remember. So MDMA the top, but very highly positively rated, and also some more negative ratings than LSD and magic mushrooms. So these are interesting relationships between the composite scores and the positive and negative scores and the frequency of use. So as I said, we wanted to see if there was an optimal amount of or frequency of drug taking to lead to better benefits and less harms. So I was kind of expecting some sort of inverted U-shape graph where it would be in the middle, but actually, as you see here, people are actually rating higher positives and relatively similar negatives as you increase your frequency of drug use. So the people that are smoking cannabis more than 100 times a year are rating it better and no more harmful than those who are smoking it 11 to 50 times a year, for example. And the same is true of tobacco and MDMA, and that's generally true across the different drugs. However, that's not a particularly sensitive measure of frequency of use because people use cannabis and tobacco way more than 100 times a year. So we've also got days used per month, and that looks like a terribly messy graph. But there's still a positive and significant linear relationship there. By the more days you use tobacco, the more composite benefits versus harm that you're taking. But should this lead you to take drugs more frequently? Definitely not, because it's probably not the frequency of use that's driving the increased pleasure and decreased or somewhat stable harm, but that people take different amounts of pleasure from each drug and then titrate their use depending on how much good stuff and how much bad stuff they're taking from it. So someone that particularly enjoys cannabis is much more likely to use it more than someone who doesn't really like it. So it's definitely not to say that you're going to get more positive benefits from drug use with more frequent drug use. So, general discussion. MDMA and psychedelic drugs come out very favourably in terms of benefits and low harms for the hallucinogens. Alcohol and tobacco are legal drugs rated very poorly by the users taking this survey. MDMA is very positive but also has some high negative ratings. The serotonergic hallucinogens don't feature at all in the top 3 negative aspects of well, all of the 10 negative aspects, they didn't feature in the top 3 of those. And frequency almost certainly not causing high scores. So the hypothesis that we had before that there might be an optimal drug taking point, probably not confirmed. So this is particularly interesting, looking at the relationships between user ratings of benefits and harms against the UK class system and David Nutt's expert ratings of harms. So there's a very strong negative relationship between the user's ratings of benefits and harms and the UK class system. So MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, all class A, and rated the best by users here, and alcohol and tobacco, legal, rated the worst. So it seems like it's completely the other way around in the way that users think about drugs in comparison to the law, and obviously we all already know that, you know, the law doesn't really make much sense. But interestingly, when you look at the ratings of the users for their negative outcomes, the harms, and David Nutt's harm rankings, there's a positive relationship here. It doesn't quite reach significance, so the P is just above 0.05, but you can see that there's a linear relationship there. So the more harmful users think the drugs are, the more harmful David Nutt's experts think they are. So there's some sort of agreement there, which is good, I think. And perhaps the positive effects should be considered when thinking about the laws of these different recreational drugs, not just the harms. So the limitations of this part of the, and generally across the survey, weightings. As I mentioned before, David Nutt weighted his aspects when he was ranking the harms. So one thing may be particularly important in comparison to others, and that should affect the overall score. So we didn't do that, we didn't have weightings. So it might be that one aspect is so much more important that it could change everything that I just showed you. So we really need to do that before we report it formally. Causal relationships, beware, that's just relating to the frequency of use and benefits and harms. It's self-reported data, so it's probably biased. Maybe people want to be more positive about their drug use than it really is, and it's retrospective. So you're always rating about things that happened in the past, and maybe you have memory biases, so you can't be sure about that. It's a biased and self-selecting sample, so the kind of people who are doing this probably like drugs, so they're biased in comparison to the general population. You can't generalize to them, really. And as I said before, it's not really pleasure per se, but it's interesting when you're thinking about the benefits and harms of different drugs. So I'll move on to sex and drugs now. They're obviously very often linked, but there's been no large-scale quantitative comparison across the effects of different recreational drugs on a variety of kind of sexual variables like sexual pleasure, sexual desire, and performance. So it would be good to kind of be able to compare the effects of these drugs on sex. So there's loads of animal studies looking at how different recreational drugs affect the sexual behavior of animals. It's usually kind of crude measures, like things like mount frequency. So how often is a male rat mounting a female rat when you give them certain amounts of drugs? The latency to ejaculate and the latency between different intromissions. So it's quite abstracted from kind of the effects of drugs on human sexuality. But they interestingly find, so this is a graph of the effects of cocaine on mount frequency of rats. And so with 7.5 milligrams per kilogram injection of cocaine, you actually significantly increase the amount that a male rat is mounting a female rat. But then when you give it another injection, so that's the third bar across on the 7.5 bit, when you give it another injection, it goes back down to normal. So a bit of cocaine for a rat, pretty good in terms of making it want to have sex more, but too much, not too good. And interestingly, methamphetamine, which is often linked with kind of having sex in some communities, actually has like a decreasing effect on mount frequency and latency to mount, which is, you know, surprising and shows the difference between how abstract animal studies are to human studies. So the human studies on sex and drugs have mostly concerned risky sexual behaviour. That's the way kind of they're framed in academia. So one study's looked at how treatment for methamphetamine use actually leads to less risky sexual behaviour. And this is an amazingly titled paper called Bump and Grind, and it's about how methadone might affect sexual behaviour, a very sensationalist academic reporting. So apparently it leads to compulsive masturbation, propositioning of strangers, and prolonged marathon drug sex encounters. So, you know, quite strange study of methadone there. Klein did a PhD looking at the endocannabinoid system in female sexual arousal, demonstrating its important role. So there's lots of links, but we wanted to quantitatively compare different drugs' effects on sexual desire, pleasure and performance, and see whether there are any gender differences between the effects of these drugs. And of course some of the drugs are associated with risky sexual behaviour, so maybe that can be related to their subjective effects. So we asked about alcohol, amphetamine, cannabis, cocaine, crystal meth, GHB or GBL, which I'll just refer to as GHB from now on, ketamine, MDMA, methadone, poppers and Viagra. So if you used any of those drugs in the last 12 months, you then went on to say which were the 3 most commonly used, and then you'd rate them from -10 to 10 on intensity, the changes on intensity of orgasm, sensual aspects, overall performance, erection and moistness, sexual desire, emotionality, and multiple orgasms in a session. So these are the results for men. So as you can see, it's quite a complicated graph, but you've got the different aspects around the side, and then each drug is represented by a colour. And also, again, note the difference in numbers of people rating each drug. That becomes problematic. So, you know, fewer people rating crystal meth, methamphetamine than alcohol. But as you can see, Viagra doing its job well, increasing the erection the most, and also overall performance and multiple orgasms in a session for men. Alcohol, interestingly, increases sexual desire a lot, but terrible for the other ones. So, so clearly it makes you want to have sex, but then you're not having a good time and you're not making the other person have a good time. But as you can look around, GHB seems to be rated very positively, and so does methamphetamine, especially for intensity of orgasm there. And MDMA, good for sensual aspects of sex and emotionality, as you'd expect from its usual effects. And now for women, so fewer people rating it for women, so fewer women rating these drugs, because that in this survey, I think there's twice as many men that do it for some reason. So here we can see GHB again positively rated around the board, but very few people, only 30 people rating it. Again, alcohol, good for sexual desire, not good for the others. Basically very similar results to the men really. But I took out Viagra and poppers because there was only like 4 women who had used them. So discussion of these findings. There's an important limitation with some drugs rated more than others. So loads and loads of people clearly have sex when they're drunk on alcohol, but very few people have sex when they've taken, say, GHB, even though that was rated very highly, very positively. And that can have a biasing effect, because it might be that, you know, if everyone has sex on alcohol, then, you know, people don't necessarily particularly like the effects, whereas if you're having sex on, say, crystal meth, you may well have chosen to do that because you like it. So there's a biasing effect to those that are rated by fewer people. Specific groups are associated with using some drugs more than others. So in this survey, there were significantly more gay men rating GHB and crystal meth and their effects on sex than straight men. So that's a confounding factor in the ratings. But generally, methamphetamine, GHB, Viagra and MDMA were rated, you know, that's obviously a very crude way to describe it, but they were rated positively for sex, and alcohol was rated generally badly except for sexual desire. So that's me done. To conclusion, so hallucinogens and MDMA, well, hallucinogens, little harm and great benefits. MDMA, slightly bigger harm, but even bigger benefits rated by users. And of course, remember that we need weightings. So in order for the scale to be more meaningful, we need to get people to rate what are the most important aspects so that you can get a better composite rating of harm and benefit. There was a negative relationship with UK classification and a trend relationship with David Nutt's experts. So it seems like users and experts have agreement on the harms and benefits, or harms in this case, and that they should be taken into account much more in the laws. And for sex, GHB, methamphetamine, Viagra and MDMA were generally rated highly. So, and thanks again to my supervisors and Adam Winstock.